So you might be thinking, what are we doing in our basement? Are we doing laundry? Are we doing maintenance, storage? No. In fact, today we are gonna open the very fucking gates of hell because, sinning, murdering your brother and all this, they just take too long. Why not just open a hole in your basement floor in Blender and just get right to it? No need to, mess with all that sinning stuff. It takes too long, quite frankly. A while ago I did make a tutorial about how to make a crater in Blender, and you might think, okay, this is similar, and it really is, but this, you'll notice it's different. It's not a crater, it's a ravine. It goes very long. I'll teach you how to make it and also how to open it up procedurally like this. Okay, so now that we've gone through the intro, let's just get started. I'm just frustrated because I've done this intro like 1,000 times, but I'm sticking with this one. This is the take. It has a lot of energy. Normally our story would begin with filming some footage and doing motion tracking and then procedurally adding this crater. And that's what we're gonna do, although I have skipped the first step or two because that's a nice desktop. Because I've done a lot of motion tracking in recent tutorials. I will upload this file on Patreon and all that for people that, want the motion tracking stuff. I've done too much motion tracking recently, so I thought, you know what, that's not really necessary for a tutorial about ravines. Let's just get into how to make the fucking hole procedurally using shading nodes and all that. So whatever shot you want to use, just motion track something, or really you don't need a shot at all. You could just make a ravine. So first step, you're going to add in a plane. Why add in a plane? Because this is where our ravine is going to be. We're not actually going to do it with modeling. We're going to make this kind of noisy thing using displacement with procedural shading and all that. So take this edit mode. I'm going to scale this up to be the bounding box of whatever my ravine is going to be. So I'm just moving it, or actually I'm just going to move it further in like this. And you just want to reshape your plane until you're happy with it. Let me actually make it a bit bigger in this direction. Okay, so there we go. This is basically the surface that we're going to make our ravine in. It could be any shape, although a plane is in fact the easiest. In fact, let me go to full screen before people yell at me. So once you have this, the rest of the story is really in shading. So go to the shading workspace. We're going to go to the top view. At least for now, we're going to be working in Eevee, working with some, noises and stuff like that, texture coordinates. And then when we're ready, we're going to switch over to cycles. So to create the ravine, it's actually very, very simple. Create a material and find all your nodes. For me, that's over there. By the way, you can hit the period key to do what I just did. You're over there. Period key. Incredible. My favorite hotkey. What you want to do is get rid of this and start off with some texture coordinates. And the idea is we're going to start off with a circle. We're going to feather the circle, distort it, and then add a bunch of noise until it looks like a ravine kind of alpha. So to start with step one, I'm all over the place. For step one, to make the circle, easiest thing ever, take your object coordinates, and what we're going to do is use some vector math and set this to length. And what this is going to do is take our object coordinates, again, these are texture coordinates with x-axis, y-axis, etc., where this is the origin 0, 0, 0. We are going to find the length of those vectors. In other words, the 0, 0, 0 vector is going to have length 0, so it's going to be black. And as we radially go away from the center, or actually spherically away since it's three-dimensional, it's going to increase in magnitude and scale and radius, so it gets brighter and brighter and brighter. Take this, add a map range node. We're just going to throw that in there. We want to invert this so the center is white and the outskirts are black. You can do that with a 1, 0 switch. So instead of 0, 1, 1, 0 for the output, and that gives us our circle. And then finally, to make this bigger, we need to take our input interval and just scale that up. And if you don't really understand what's going on here, me neither. We're on the same boat. Don't worry about it. Just add in this map range node, and you can mess with some settings to mess with the gradient, or maybe, kind of the size and radius of this thing, okay? So once you have the circle, what we want to do is stretch this into an ellipse or into an oval or a capsule. I guess it's closest to an ellipse. And the reason we want to do that is because our ravine is long. It's not a crater. It's not circular. To do that, you can either add in some mapping coordinates or just add in another vector math, but only set it to multiply since that is all that we need. And if we multiply by 1, 1, 1, effectively nothing happens, but we can stretch along the x-axis in either direction to make an ellipse that still has our feathering. And boom, we have an ellipse that we can procedurally control in the sense of, the size and the shape and the quality of our gradient and all that. And now the next step, and this is kind of a trick that I've talked about over and over and over again, is how do we add noise to this plane? How do we take this ellipse and add some spice to it, make a complicated recipe? Well, here's how you do it. First of all, we add in some noise. right here. So we have our texture coordinates and the noise, and somehow we want to mix these two ideas together. And whenever you want to mix things together, it's always best to add. So we are going to add, if you want to mix up your marriage, just add in another person. You know what I mean? That can't go wrong. So we have our object coordinates, and we've added some noise, which actually distorts our cylinder, although you probably notice that this kind of has shifted this down, and this is the kind of setup that people usually use for blurring. As you increase this, you can see it kind of feathers this out. But you can see that as we added our noise, as I talked about, this thing has shifted downwards, and that's because, and it's kind of for a technical reason, when you add in a noise texture, basically on every point in the plane, it's going to add some random value between 0 and 1, which means on average, we are adding 0.5 on X, Y, and Z, so it has shifted down by 0.5. To fix this, what you want to do is add in a subtraction node, set this to 0.5, boom, and now you can see this is centered. Again, the reason this happens is because we add 0.5 on X, Y, and Z, so we have to correct by subtracting that very same 0.5, 0.5, 0.5 on average. And a trick that I always like talking about is, yes, you can kind of already mess with this to create different types of, craters. I increase the detail and the roughness, etc. But what really gives you control is saying, okay, we have this noise, it's blended in, but can I control the strength, not just the scale, detail, roughness, the strength of the noise? And it turns out that you can. Just add in another vector math node, set it to scale, if I can find scale. So this is going to be the magnitude, the strength, the how fucking intense is the noise, which we can control right here. But you can see as we make it weaker or stronger, it does that drifting thing again, because now instead of drifting by 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, it drifts by that scaled by this value. So actually what we need to do is add in another scale node with the vector, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, connect this here, and then add in a value node so we control the strength of these with the same amount. So in other words, we are scaling our noise, but we need to correct by the same correction vector that is scaled as well. And long story short, when we do this, it actually lets us control this size or the effect of the noise, where we can still control the detail and the roughness and stuff like that. Okay, I'm just gonna increase and bump up my noise. Generally, this is all you need to make your ravine, so you have a bunch of control. You can control the shape of it. Most importantly, you can control this slider, which is what opens and closes the ravine. This is what opens and closes the gates of hell. This is the key that opens the lock. We can control all this stuff, but the question is, how do we take this thing that is motion tracked on and actually have it displaced downwards? To do this, you actually need material displacement, which Eevee, it doesn't do it. I don't know if it's ever going to do it, so what we need to do is switch over to cycles, set this to support it. I don't know why it was an experimental. Just use cycles with normal settings, and then in our material, we are going to have this actually displaced. So add in a displacement node, connect everything we've done, this black and white alpha gradient that's basically determining the height, take it and actually plug it into the height. It makes sense, we're making this thing that determines height, may as well plug it into height and then into the displacement socket of the material output node. And let's actually add in something for the surface just so we can see what's going on. You can see that it's actually doing something very faint. It's doing some bump mapping. However, it's not doing any displacement mapping. And you're thinking, okay, this is fine. It reacts to lighting. So in some sense, it does work. So you can see, it actually reacts to lighting. It does work, but it's not actually displacing our geometry. To fix this, go to the material settings, go to settings, and then in displacement, don't have it only do bump. But make sure you have some kind of displacement. So either displacement only or displacement and bump if you want to get crazy. So now you can see our geometry is actually being displaced. However, it's shifting everything down. So take your mid-level, set it to 0. And then finally, to have displacement for our geometry, we of course need more, you guessed it, geometry. So you can either do that by subdividing, so adding in more geometry, which will give it more stuff to displace. It's kind of hard to see, but this is actually rising up. You could either do it like that, or since we're doing this whole procedural idea, let's add in a subdivision surface, a procedural way to add in geometry, set it to simple, and as we increase this, we are getting more and more displacement, which is obvious when we increase the scale. Okay, so displacement, I'm gonna bump this up to something like 8, and so this is scaling inwards, not upwards, so it's not making a mountain, but instead of making a mountain, instead it goes inwards. What we do is set this to a negative number. So scale -5 or -2 or whatever it may be. So I'm going to do -3 or something for now, where this is kind of like the depth going inward. So you can see it's motion tracked correctly, and maybe it's easier to see if we add in a light. There we go. You can see we have this ravine motion tracked in here, and it actually has some depth to it. Okay, so how do we take this? How do we take this ravine now and actually composite it? Not in the sense of compositing with nodes, but how do we, in our 3D viewport, how do we actually integrate it so that this plane up here, not the crater, but the plane, by the way, not crater ravine, this is not the same tutorial. How do we take this plane and actually show our footage, our basement floor? Well, to do that, we actually have a very simple technique. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a holdout shader. And the difference between, by the way, the difference between holdout and transparency is they both kind of make your surface transparent. So let's actually view it. So you can see through it. It's transparent. Same with the holdout. They do the same thing in this sense. Although holdout will actually not show anything beneath it. So I'm going to put a cube under our crater. And you can see even though it's transparent, we can't see it, even though it's underneath. Whereas with a transparent shader, you can actually see through it like glass. So that's what holdout does. Okay, so why do we want holdout? What we're going to do is we're going to take holdout and our diffuse, which is what's going to show our crater. We're going to mix these two ideas together. And then we want to say only use holdout, this idea of transparency that you can't see through, so we can't see the bottom of our crater. Only do that wherever the z, how like high up it is like equal to 0. So to do this, add in a geometry node, look at the position coordinates, but only the z coordinate right here. So we're looking at the z-axis. Of course, we don't see anything because right now z is set to 0 and anything below 0 is negative. So if I was to like multiply this by -1, multiply by -1, you can actually see what's going on here. But we kind of want to isolate 0 and everything going slightly beneath. So again, this is a job for map range node. Map range node's been getting a lot of action today. We don't want it to get a big ego. It's getting cocky. We are going to take our input interval not from 0 to 1, but from 0 to like -0.01 or something like that. So it starts at 0 and then it goes downwards in depth just a tiny bit. Maybe this is a bit too much, something like this, -0.23, so it has a bit of fading going like that. And then we are just going to invert this, so 1, 0. So we've isolated the top, okay? So now we have a nice procedural way to make a mask here. We're going to take this as our factor for the mix shader, plug in there, view this, and then flip these so that we actually now have a crater. Again, not a crater, it's a ravine that's contained, and you can't see the bottom of it, and you can see the holdout shader, and it's all looking good. And in fact, let me first of all change the linear to smoother step, which is just going to change the interpolation. So I'm just zooming in here. So smoother step just gives us a smoother interpolation, and let's make this a bit less gradual. So let's have it only go to -0.125 or something. So it's a bit of a harsher kind of change with smoother step. So now we have that, and we can actually, let's get rid of this cube. We can actually still reshape everything, and everything still works procedurally. So I'm just going to make this look a bit more like a ravine. So I'm looking for the multiply node and make this a bit, make it a bit thinner, just like that. Something like this. I don't think I changed too much. So we have this setup going on right now, and to make this thing open and close, like, you know, the gates of hell joke that I've made a million times, and that really isn't funny. What we need to do is take this max and just bring it down. So let's have it be actually at 0. We'll have it go like 20 frames into the animation, I for keyframe, 20 more frames down, and then we'll have it open up to some amount like this. Okay? So now we have this thing that actually opens up with the holdout shader and all this. And we could still mess with some stuff with our ravine. Do we want it to be like detailed or not detailed? Or do we want it to have a lot of noise? Or do we want it to be very circular? These are all questions you want to consider. I wouldn't want to die without thinking about the answers to those. You might have some regrets. Okay, so now we have our ravine. How do we make it look like not gray rock, but something that might look realistic? Well, first of all, maybe you want to add some better lighting. So I'm going to add in a sun, make the shadow a bit softer. So the angle is kind of like the softness of the shadow. And you can see on our basement floor, we have some light shadows, some slightly feathered shadows, etc. So let's just set this to like something like 15, just so it's a bit softer. And then for the color of our diffuse BSDF, you know, this thing, what we want to do is pick some colors that match our floor. And in fact, we can pick multiple colors. So I'm going to use a color ramp node, plug this in, as the color. So now we can actually use 2 colors for our setup, and I'm gonna drive this with our noise. So in other words, this noise that basically drives our displacement, we can use it to also color code our diffuse BSDF, which is a good thing because it means wherever there's low valleys and stuff like that, we're gonna have one color and ridges, something else, etc. So for the first color, I'm just gonna use the color picker and pick something from the floor. And for the second one, I'm gonna pick a different color from the floor. And we can actually mix these together a bit better. Something like this, just so we have a bit more contrast. Okay, now we have this. It's still looking pretty bad, and that's just a lighting thing. So let's take our strength, make it brighter. There we go. And I'm seeing that this looks a bit, or by a bit, I mean way too saturated. So let's like take the saturation down to something that looks nicer, just so it doesn't pop as much. There we go. And I'm thinking that in general, this is looking pretty good. I do want it to go a bit deeper, so it actually displaces more downwards. So I'm gonna pick a bigger negative, a larger in magnitude negative number. So like -5, it goes further down, just so we have a ravine that we really need to look into. And we could go crazy with this, like -10 or something. And I'm thinking another thing we could do is play around with the gradient, kind of like the fall off of this situation, which you can see kind of makes it a sharper slope, which might be something you're interested in. So let's do something like 0.25, just so it goes down a bit more intensely. There we go. And by the way, I don't think we have it in this situation, but if the bottom of the ravine is poking out in your shot, what you can do is just take this edge and bring it a bit further out, which does mess with our procedural noise a bit, but it generally doesn't mess around with it too much. Okay, so what do we have? What is happening here? There we go. So we have this ravine opening up. Maybe it's a bit too sharp, whatever. You can play around with these settings, and it tracks onto our shot. It looks beautiful. And like, long story short, the rest of this, the same way that I didn't do motion tracking on camera, I'm not gonna do any of the compositing on camera, but I'll give you a bit of a hint on how to render this. Make sure that when you disable your your background images for your camera, that this is all transparent in the background. If it's not, render tab, go to film, if I can find film, it's right here, film, and make sure transparent is enabled, okay? This is what's gonna make it look good, and also motion blur, to render this out with motion blur. Really, for the rest of this, you just wanna play around with exposure and stuff like that, so maybe you can mess around with your gamma to get a different looking crater, etc. Most of this, it really was just color correction. This is really all we needed. I don't know why it's glitching out here. That's kind of weird. We could have it like not appear before then, is the idea. So if you're having an issue like this, which I wasn't, but if you are, you could keyframe visibility. So on this frame, it's gonna be visible in the viewport and render, and everything before that, it will not be, just so you're not getting any issues. And then it opens up, etc. And then once you put in some love, some care, love is the secret, and love, or really color correction, is the secret ingredient to this recipe, you're gonna get something that looks good. And what makes this look good is the color correction. I blurred it a little bit because the render was coming off a bit sharp, especially with that noise doing all our displacement. You also want to, color, blur. I don't know what else there was. That was pretty much it. Anyways, I hope you learned how to make a ravine in this tutorial. I know it was a bit jumbled, and it's because of that craze I had in the beginning of doing this intro 1,000 times, but hopefully I got that information out there. You now know how to do this whole kind of thing procedurally. The file for the motion tracking and all that is going to be available on Patreon. At least I'll try to make it available on Patreon. And by the way, if you're interested in exclusive tutorials that aren't uploaded to YouTube for free, in other words, VIP access and stuff like that, Patreon is the place to get stuff like that. You also get access with your Patreon membership to stuff like behind the scenes, project files, obviously, exclusive content, Discord access, things like this. But in general, that is what lets Default Cube and CG Matter thrive and exist and be the top of the ladder, thanks to the 500 some people who have already done that. And I'm thankful to all of you and to all of the new people who want to join Patreon. It's a pretty cool thing. Very cool. Anyways, hopefully you know how to make a ravine now. Go to your basement, open the pits of hell. Let me know how that goes. And that's it. See ya.